is a place fit only for war. Thousands of square miles are nothing but sand and stone. A compass is as necessary, once off the road, as it is to a sailor at sea. Water doesn't exist until you bore deep into the earth. You bath in your shaving mud. Flies have the tenacity of bulldogs. Bruises readily earn to desert sores. Days that are very hot can be followed by nights of bitter cold. When the hot Kamsin wind brings its sandstorms, life can be intolerable. The Arabs say that after 5 days of it, murder can be excused. The tide of this war in the desert has ebbed and flowed. But as Rommel advanced after we lost Tobruk, never had our backs been so close to the Suez Wall. We had lost 80,000 men and much booty. There were earlier lines of defense on which General Auchinleck might have stood, Sidi Barrani or Mirza Matruh, for example. But he was deliberately falling back on El Alamein, no more than 60 miles from Alexandria. To Rommel, advancing at considerable speed, Egypt, with the Nile Delta which gives it life, Cairo, British General Headquarters and Africa's principal city, Alexandria, Egypt's chief port and base of our Mediterranean fleet, and Suez, gateway to the far.
The desert does not forgive mistakes. It only records them. On the night of the 16th and 17th of November, 1941-5, Bristol-Bombay aircraft climbed into a black sky over Egypt. Inside them sat around 65 men, crouched in the cold, waiting to jump into enemy territory. They were the first soldiers of a new unit that almost nobody in the British Army believed in. One aircraft was shot down with all aboard killed.
Within a few hours, most of the rest would be dead, wounded, scattered, or captured without firing a meaningful shot. To understand how they ended up in those aircraft, you have to go back a few months to a hospital bed. The summer of 1941, North Africa. The war in the Western Desert was a war of vast distances and thin supply lines, a place where armies chased each other across hundreds of miles of sand and rock.
The German Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, had pushed the British back. Everything the enemy needed to fight came forward on trucks and ships, and their aircraft sat parked on desert airfields, refueling, rearming, waiting for the next mission. Lying in that hospital was a young lieutenant named David Stirling. He was 25 years old, Scottish, and very tall, so tall that he stooped.
He had been injured in a parachute experiment that had gone wrong. Before the war, Stirling had a reputation that was not flattering. He was seen as lazy, disorganized, a young man of good family who drifted through things. Some officers called him the giant sloth. He was not the obvious candidate to invent anything. But in that hospital bed, Stirling had a simple, dangerous idea.
The British were fighting the Desert War like a conventional war, with large formations moving in the open. Stirling thought that was the wrong approach. What if a very small number of men, dropped or driven behind enemy lines, could destroy aircraft on the ground? Aircraft that were expensive, hard to replace, and defenseless while parked. You would not need an army.
You would need a handful of trained, ruthless men and the nerve to walk into the enemy's backyard at night. The problem was getting anyone to listen. The story of how Stirling reached the senior commanders has been told many ways, and some of the details are uncertain. What is clear is that a junior, unfashionable officer somehow got his idea in front of the men who mattered at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, and the idea was approved.
He was given permission to raise a tiny unit, about 60 men, and he was given a name that was itself a lie. Here's the first twist in this story. The unit was called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. That word, brigade, suggested a large formation, thousands of men, a serious airborne force. It was deliberate.
British intelligence in the Middle East, run by a deception officer named Dudley Clark, had already invented a fictional parachute brigade to fool the enemy into believing the British had a powerful new airborne capability in the theatre. Stirling's real unit was quietly attached to that fiction. So the famous name that would one day mean the most elite soldiers in the world began as a trick. There was no brigade.
There were about 60 men in the sand, and most of them had never fought together. To turn those men into something real, Stirling needed someone who could actually build a soldier. He found him in another lieutenant, John Lewes, known to everyone as Jock. Lewes was around 27. He had spent part of his youth in Australia and had rowed at Oxford, where he had led the University Boat Club. Where Stirling was the dreamer and the salesman, Lewes was the mind of discipline. He designed the training. He drove the men across the desert on brutal marches, teaching them to move at night, to navigate, to survive on almost no water. He understood that raw courage was not enough. Men had to be conditioned until the impossible felt routine. Lewes also solved a technical problem that Stirling's whole idea depended on. To destroy an aircraft, you needed a charge that could both blow the machine apart and set its fuel alight. The standard options were too heavy or did only one job. So Lewes experimented until he created a small portable charge that combined explosive and incendiary material. It became known as the Lewes bomb. A single man could carry several of them, walk onto an airfield, and burn a squadron of aircraft to nothing. Their base was at Cabrit, on the Suez Canal. When they arrived, there was almost nothing there. The story goes that the men stole tents and equipment from a nearby New Zealand camp to build their own. It was a fitting start for a unit that would always live on the edge of the rules. Then came the target.
In November of 1941, the British Eighth Army was preparing a major offensive called Operation Crusader, an attempt to relieve the besieged port of Tobruk and drive Rommel back. Stirling's men were given a role in it.
Their mission, codenamed Operation Squatter, was to parachute into the desert at night, march to a group of forward-axis airfields near Gazala and Tamimi, and destroy the German and Italian aircraft parked there before the big offensive began. Wreck the enemy's air power on the ground, in the dark, and slip away. It was exactly the idea Stirling had dreamed up in his hospital bed, and it depended entirely on one method: parachuting.
That method was the foundation of the whole unit. It was the reason they existed. It was in the name. In the days before the raid, the weather forecast turned bad, very bad. High winds were sweeping the coast, the kind of winds that turn a parachute jump into a lottery with your own life. Dropping men by parachute in a storm, at night, over unfamiliar ground, was close to suicidal. The decision fell to Stirling.
Canceling would mean his brand new unit had failed to appear at the very first operation it had been created for. It could mean the end of the whole experiment before it had begun. The pressure was not only military, it was personal, and it was about proving that the giant sloth had been right. He chose to go. Here is the second twist, and it is the one that almost killed the idea in its cradle. The night of the 16th of November.
The aircraft, Bristol Bombays, lifted off and flew out over the desert into the storm. Below, the wind was tearing across the sand. The men jumped anyway. Almost immediately, everything went wrong. The wind caught the parachutes and flung the men across the desert like leaves. Some were slammed into the ground at terrible speed. Bones broke. Men were knocked unconscious or dragged along the rocks by canopies that would not collapse.
The containers holding their weapons, their explosives, their food and water, drifted away in the dark and were lost. Groups that were supposed to land together came down miles apart, scattered across a landscape with no landmarks. There was no attack on the airfields. There was barely a unit left to attack anything.
The men who could still walk gathered what little they had
and tried to move, half-blind, through the storm toward the rendezvous point where they were supposed to be collected. That rendezvous was held by another unit, one that would soon change Sterling's thinking completely, though he did not know it yet. Deep desert scouts who moved not by parachute, but by truck.
They waited at the meeting point and counted the survivors as they staggered in. The numbers were brutal. Of the roughly 65 men who had set out, only about 21 or 22 came back. The exact figures differ slightly between accounts, but the shape of it does not change. In a single night, the unit had lost more than half its strength, and it had achieved nothing. Not one enemy aircraft destroyed.
By any honest measure, Operation Squatter was a disaster. The founding method of the Special Air Service, the parachute drop that gave the unit its very name, had collapsed on its first attempt and taken most of its men with it. Somewhere in the survivors was David Sterling, the officer who had insisted on going despite the storm. He had wanted to prove his idea. Instead, he had watched it fail in the most costly way possible.
A lesser man might have accepted that the concept was simply wrong, disbanded what was left, and gone back to the regular army. And many at headquarters would have agreed. But as those exhausted, injured men climbed onto the trucks of the desert scouts and rode out of enemy territory, Sterling was already turning the failure over in his mind. He had been certain about the mission and the target.
He had been certain about small teams hitting airfields at night. He had been wrong about only one thing: how to get them there. And the answer, it turned out, was sitting right underneath him, in the wheels of the trucks, carrying him back across the sand. The trucks carried them home across the sand, and David Sterling did not sleep. He lay in the back of a vehicle he did not command, watching the men who owned it work.
They were not glamorous soldiers. They belonged to a unit called the Long Range Desert Group. Their trucks were not weapons of war in the way a tank was. They were stripped-down Chevrolet and Ford machines, worn by the desert, loaded with fuel and water and sun compasses, driven by men who could find a single point in 1,000 miles of emptiness.
The Long Range Desert Group had been founded the year before by a soldier and scientist named Ralph Bagnold, a man in his 40s who had spent years before the war exploring the deep Sahara and had learned, better than almost anyone alive, how to live and move where nothing else could. Here is the third twist in this story. The rescue was not the point. The rescue was the answer. Sterling had been obsessed with how to fall out of the sky.
And the whole time, the solution had wheels. If small teams could be driven quietly across hundreds of miles of open desert, hidden by distance instead of darkness, dropped a short walk from an enemy airfield, and picked up again afterward, then there was no need to jump at all. No storms, no broken bones, no lost containers scattered across the sand.
The officer who first put this into his head was a young captain of the desert group named David Lloyd Owen. He was around 24. It was Lloyd Owen who had helped gather the survivors, and it was Lloyd Owen who suggested, plainly, that his men could carry Sterling's raiders to their targets. The parachute had failed. The truck had never even been tried. Sterling listened.
And in listening, he saved his own idea by giving up the part of it that had nearly destroyed everything. The most feared airborne unit in history quietly stopped jumping out of airplanes. In December of 1941, they went back into the desert. This time, there were no aircraft, no storms, no parachutes. There were trucks and long, cold, silent drives under enormous stars, and men who now knew exactly what failure had cost them.
One of those men was a lieutenant named Robert Maine, known to everyone as Paddy. He was about 26, from Northern Ireland, and before the war he had been a champion rugby player, a big, powerful man who could do things with his hands that ordinary men could not. In battle he was calm, efficient, and frighteningly effective. Away from it he drank hard and his temper could turn violent. He was not a poster hero.
He was something more useful and more disturbing. A man built for exactly this kind of war.
On the night the raiders reached an airfield near a place called Tammet, Paddy Mayne walked onto it in the dark with his small team and did the work the whole idea had been created for. They moved from aircraft to aircraft, placing Lewis bombs, the small charges that Jock Lewis had designed back at their base, setting the timers and moving on.
Then the desert lit up. Fuel tanks caught. Machines that had cost the enemy a fortune and months to build burned where they stood. By most accounts, around 24 aircraft were destroyed that night, though the exact number differs between sources, as it so often does in this story. It worked. The concept that had died in a storm 3 weeks earlier was suddenly, brutally alive.
But this is where an honest account has to slow down, because there is a darker layer here, and you have earned the truth of it. This was not a clean war of blowing up empty machines. When those raiders walked onto an enemy airfield at night, they walked among men who were sleeping, eating, living. The raids meant killing at close range, in the dark, quickly and without warning.
The men who did this work were not comic book heroes moving through an empty stage. They were killing other men who had families waiting somewhere, just as they did. Some of the stories that grew up around these raids, especially around Maine, are fierce and violent, and some of the details have been argued over for decades. What is not in doubt is the nature of the thing.
This was intimate, merciless work, and the men who were good at it carried something afterward that no medal could balance. That is the price that sat underneath every success. And the successes now came quickly. Through the winter and into the new year, the raiders drove out again and again, guided by the desert group, striking airfields the enemy believed were safe behind the front, then vanishing back into the emptiness before dawn.
Then the war took back one of its own. Here is the fourth twist, and it is a quiet one, which is what makes it hurt. Jock Lewis, the mind of the whole unit, the man who had turned a rabble into soldiers and invented the bomb that made the raids possible, did not fall in a great battle. On the 30th of December, 1941, as his party was driving back from a raid near Marble Arch, an enemy aircraft strafed the column.
Lewis was hit in the thigh by a 20mm cannon round and bled to death in the sand in the open desert and strafed the column from the air. Lewis was hit. He died there in the sand, far from any front line, killed not in the act of raiding but in the long, exposed drive home. Think about what that meant.
The man who had built the discipline of the unit was killed by the very thing the unit existed to destroy. An aircraft, catching him in the open, exactly as his raiders caught the enemy's aircraft on the ground. The desert did not care who was clever. It killed the architect as easily as anyone else. They buried the loss and kept driving, because that was all there was to do.
Through the first half of 1942, the raids continued, and slowly the method kept changing, pushed forward not by grand planning but by failure in the field. And that brings us to the fifth twist, the moment the unit found its true signature, and it was born from things going wrong. In the summer of 1942, during a raid on an airfield, including actions at places like Bagush, many of the Lewis bombs failed to detonate.
Slip in on foot, place the Lewis bombs on the aircraft, slip away. But that night, many of the charges failed to go off. The bombs, sitting on the aircraft, simply did not detonate as they should have. Half the target was going to survive. After all the distance, all the risk, the raid was on the edge of being wasted. So they improvised.
Instead of walking away from the airfield they could not finish by hand, they climbed into their armed jeeps with heavy machine guns, and they drove straight onto the airfield itself. No stealth now. They raced down the line of parked aircraft with their guns hammering, tearing the machines apart with gunfire from the moving vehicles, doing in a few violent minutes what the failed bombs could not.
They did not know it yet, but they had just invented the thing that would define them. Not the silent man on foot with a satchel of explosives, the armed vehicle, driving into the heart of the enemy's airfield and shooting it to pieces at speed. The failure of the bombs had forced them into the future. From that night on, the idea sharpened. Why creep in at all if you could drive in?
Why carry a few charges if you could bring the firepower of a squadron on the backs of a handful of jeeps? The men began to arm their vehicles heavily, mounting twin aircraft machine guns, the Vickers K, in pairs, so that a single jeep could throw out a wall of fire. They had started as parachutists and failed. They had become passengers in other men's trucks and survived. Now they were becoming something new entirely.
Raiders who did not sneak past the enemy's strength, but drove directly into it and out the other side. And the man watching all of this takes shape. The tall officer who had been laughed at, buried his dead, changed his mind, and refused to quit, was now planning the operation that would show the whole desert what these jeeps could really do. The desert had recorded every mistake they had ever made. It was about to record something else.
The night of the 26th of July, 1942. The last full test of everything they had learned. The target was an airfield called Sidi Hanesh, packed with enemy aircraft, well inside hostile territory. And Sterling did not intend to creep onto it. He intended to drive onto it, in force, with headlights burning.
Around 18 jeeps assembled in the dark, each one loaded with machine guns, each one crewed by men who had buried friends and learned this trade the hard way. Before the raid, they had trained for something no raiding unit had done. They would go in not as scattered men on foot, but as a formation. 2 columns of vehicles, moving together, a disciplined block of firepower, rolling across an enemy airfield.
To find the field at night, across featureless desert, they relied on a navigator named Mike Sadler. He was around 22, and he had come to them from the Desert Group, one of the finest natural navigators of the war. In a landscape with no roads and no lights, finding a single airfield in the dark was nearly a miracle. Sadler did it by the stars and by instinct, and he put 18 jeeps exactly where they needed to be.
Then Sterling gave the signal, and the desert exploded. The jeeps rolled onto Sidi Hanesh in formation, and every gun opened at once. Streams of tracer tore into the parked aircraft from both sides. Fuel caught. Engines and wings and fuselages came apart under the fire. The men drove down the lines of aircraft, hammering them one after another, the whole airfield turning into a moving river of light and smoke and burning metal.
By most accounts, around 37 aircraft were destroyed or wrecked that night, though again, the exact figure differs from source to source. It was the purest expression of everything the failures had taught them. Not the parachute. Not the lonely man with a satchel. The armed vehicle driven straight into the enemy's strength, guns blazing, and out the other side. It was the high point. And like everything in this story, it had a cost.
Not every jeep came home. Whole men were hit. The raid was a triumph and a loss in the same breath, because that is what these operations always were. For a moment it must have seemed like they had solved the desert, that the method was perfect now, that small, fast, heavily armed teams could strike anywhere and slip away. Here is the 6th twist. The very success that made them famous led them straight into the worst mistake of all.
If a handful of men and a few jeeps could do this much damage, the thinking went, imagine what a much larger force could do against a much bigger target. So in September of 1942, after earlier attempts, the Raiders were thrown into a much larger operation. The Raiders were thrown into an operation of a completely different scale. A major raid on the port of Benghazi, codenamed Bigamy.
This was not a lean team slipping across the sand. This was a large, complex column, part of a wider set of attacks, aimed at a heavily defended objective, and everything that had made them deadly was gone. They had been powerful because they were small, quiet, and unexpected. Now, they were large, slow, and, worst of all, expected. The enemy had been warned. The defenders were ready and waiting.
When the raiders came, they drove into an alert, prepared garrison that knew they were coming. It was a failure. The column was hit hard, forced to turn back, and punished on the long retreat through the desert,
exposed once again to aircraft from above, just as Jacques Lou's had been. The formula that worked in miniature had shattered the moment it was blown up to full size. The strength of the idea had always been its smallness.
Made large, it broke. That should have been the lesson written in fire. But the war was not finished taking from them, and it saved its sharpest cut for last. Here is the seventh twist. The man who invented all of this did not get to see it through. In January of 1943, David Stirling was moving through Tunisia, pushing his raiders toward new ground as the armies closed in on the Axis in North Africa.
And near a place called Gabes, on the 24th of January it ended. Stirling was captured. The tall, restless officer who had dreamed the whole thing up in a hospital bed, who had failed on a stormy night and refused to quit, who had turned a disaster into a weapon, was taken prisoner. He would spend the rest of the war behind wire, trying again and again to escape, eventually locked away in the fortress prison of Colditz.
The founder of the Special Air Service watched the rest of the war from a cell. Think about the arc of it. He had survived the storm that killed most of his first command. He had survived every airfield raid, every long drive home under the guns, and in the end it was not a raid that took him, but the simple, grinding advance of the war, catching up to a man who could not stop pushing forward. The unit did not die with his capture.
It was reorganized, and command of the raiding force passed to Paddy Mayne, the champion rugby player from Northern Ireland. The man who was calm in battle and troubled out of it, who led the special raiding squadron onward. The idea outlived the man who created it, which is the truest measure of an idea. And here is where this desert story reaches all the way into our own time.
Everything these men learned, they learned by failing and correcting. Parachutes failed, so they used trucks. Trucks belonged to someone else, so they built their own armed jeeps. Stealth failed at Bagish, so they drove straight in with guns. They discovered at great cost that in the desert the right vehicle mattered more than the biggest weapon.
That mobility, self-sufficiency, and the ability to move unseen across brutal ground could beat a stronger, better-equipped enemy. That lesson never went away. Decades later, when British Special Forces returned to the deserts of the Middle East to fight a new enemy, they made a choice that would have made perfect sense to David Stirling.
They set aside heavy, purpose-built military vehicles in favor of something lighter, tougher, and easier to keep running in that unforgiving land, patrol vehicles built on the bones of the ordinary Toyota, the kind of machine that could blend into the landscape and be repaired anywhere. Different war, different machine. The same idea, born in the sand in 1941, paid for in broken bones, and lost friends and a founder in a prison cell.
The desert does not forgive mistakes. It only records them, and the men who survived long enough to learn from theirs changed the way wars are fought, right down to the vehicle in the sand.